Hi, I'm Lisa. Welcome to Biblical Reality Check. In this video episode, we'll be talking about the narrative of Adam and Eve found in the book of Genesis, chapter 3. I'd first like to say that the story of Adam and Eve is allegorical in nature, and Adam and Eve are archetypes and not historical individuals. For that reason, I will not only be retelling the story in this episode for people who have never heard it, I will be decoding it for understanding. This decode won't just be theological, it will be psychological, symbolic, and quantum. This video will be longer than the other videos thus far because it's very important that I get this decode right. The story of Adam and Eve isn't just one chapter in the Bible that people rarely, if ever, discuss when talking about the Bible. It's the story of humanity itself that reverberates throughout the entire Bible, from Abraham to Jesus. It's not an overstatement to say that a correct interpretation is absolutely essential if we are to correctly interpret and understand every character and story that follows it. So let's start this decode with a short summary of the allegory as it appears in Genesis chapter 3. Man and woman, later named Adam and Eve, are living in a paradise setting called the Garden of Eden. They're told by God that they may eat from any tree in the garden except for the tree of knowledge of good and evil, for if they eat from that tree, they will die. One day, a serpent sidles up to the woman and begins a conversation whereby it tells her she surely will not die if she eats the fruit from the tree. God only told her that because he knew that if she ate it, her eyes would be opened and she would be just like God, knowing good and evil. Eve is convinced by the snake and she takes a bite. She then gives the fruit to Adam to eat as well. After eating the fruit, they both put on fig leaves and hide in the bushes when God comes strolling through the garden looking for them. Upon confrontation, they refuse to acknowledge that they have eaten from the tree and instead blame each other and the serpent. Seeing that they'll not get back to what they know is true and admit what they did, God exiles them from the garden and places a fiery sword at the entrance so that they cannot return, eat from the tree of life, and live forever in their new state of mind. So that's the gist of the story. Now let's get into some of its symbology. Instead of taking this allegory literally, which is literally a silly thing to do, let's reframe it so that it has some actual relevance to a human mind, which is why the story and the Bible itself was written. And let's begin by asking ourselves, what if Eden isn't made of soil and sky, but of code and light? What if the story isn't about fruit, but cognition? What if it's a tale of how a mind's internal code gets rewritten to show how we human beings rationalize, deceive, and reprogram ourselves in order to survive in external environments we must live in? God tells man and woman they may eat from any tree except the tree of knowledge of good and evil, for if they eat from that tree, they will die. To get to the root of why anyone does or says what they do or say, we should always try to determine their intent or motive. Traditionally, God's prohibition of the tree of knowledge of good and evil has been interpreted as God wanting obedience from Adam and Eve, but instead they disobey God when they take a bite of the fruit they were told not to have. However, we have already established in this video series that God is not a judgmental authoritarian in the sky, barking out orders. God is the energetic hum that vibrates through all, including every one of us. The significance of the prohibition is not about a parent prohibiting a child from doing something they want to do. It's about preserving alignment with the architecture of reality. Obedience implies hierarchy. Resonance implies harmony. The character of God in the story knows that if man and woman were to know about good and evil, it would bring them out of resonance with creation and into resistance. It would signal the birth of separation from their own internal hum of creation. God wants to prevent that from happening. Before the biting of the fruit, man and woman are living in a state of ontological unity. No separation, no judgment, just being. This mirrors the law of divine oneness and the law of vibration. Everything in the garden is interconnected, flowing, and humming. When the serpent speaks to woman, he tells her she will not die if she eats the fruit. God just doesn't want her to have it because if she eats it, her eyes will be opened and she will be just like God, knowing good and evil. Essentially, the character of the serpent is turning the tables on God here. We'll see in a moment how God was being protective of man and woman by keeping them from having the same knowledge as him. God wasn't doing it to protect his turf, as the snake believes and ultimately convinces Eve is true. Previously, we asked ourselves what God's motive was in prohibiting the tree from man and woman. Now we should ask what the snake's motive was in telling woman she wouldn't die and that God just didn't want her to have the same knowledge because it would put her on an equal footing with him. Sounds to me like it was a power play and woman falls for it. Verses 6 and 7 tells us that she comes to see the fruit as pleasing to the eye and desirable for gaining wisdom, and she takes a bite. Woman doesn't just bite the fruit. She rationalizes lies into truth to get what she wants. Verse 7 says, "Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they realized they were naked. So they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves." This obviously wasn't a snake doing all the talking. It was woman's own internal hum being reprogrammed as a means for grabbing power in the garden and getting what she personally wants without guilt. We know this because when God confronts woman and man, they don't say they're sorry, they deflect. Man blames woman, woman blames the serpent, and neither one takes ownership. This isn't shame, it's ego preservation. Shame is an emotion someone feels when they have some degree of awareness that what they did is wrong. Woman has already convinced herself that the fruit of the tree is good for food, pleasing to the eye, and desirable for gaining wisdom. Why would anyone feel shame when they think that doing wrong is right and good? They don't put fig leaves on to cover their nakedness out of shame. The text itself doesn't mention anything about shame. It says that they realize they are naked and sew fig leaves together. That's a behavioral shift, not an emotional confession. The fig leaves aren't about guilt or shame, they're about territorial consciousness. With the leaves, they are putting God on notice that they are now the rulers of the garden, and they are the ones who define what is right and good and wrong and evil. The fig leaves are their visual representation of their declaration of separation. Looking at their separation from a quantum perspective, one could say that man and woman are in superposition before the fruit eating incident, a state of pure potential with no judgment, just existence. In this state, their existence mirrors the laws of divine oneness and vibration, where everything is interconnected, flowing, and humming. After they take a bite, they collapse into defined selves. Definition births division. Once you define me, you define not me. It's the beginning of separation, projection, and eventually religion. They step out of resonance, exactly what God was trying to prevent. When they are questioned by God, they have one last opportunity to get back on track with their original programming, but instead, they choose to deflect and blame each other and the snake. God knows that they will remain in their ego conscious state and cannot allow them to eat from the tree of life and live forever in that state. So he exiles them from the garden and places a fiery sword at the entrance. The rest of the Bible is an analysis of how the ego consciousness manifests in each of its characters to a greater or lesser degree until we get to Jesus, who is better than anyone else before him in teaching us how to get through the fiery sword and back to our original programming as energy made in the divine image of the source creator. And as a side note, it was because of his consciousness teachings that the ego conscious Pharisees ordered Jesus' arrest and execution. If you haven't deduced already, Adam and Eve are not two people who lived long ago or even ancient myth or allegory. They are you, they are me, they are how the human mind works. I have written about how humanity went through a long time in its evolution with a self focused mindset, prioritizing individual or tribal survival over collective harmony and connection. Our internal hum of harmony and unity, as illustrated by Genesis 1:27, saying we are made in the hum's image, gets rewritten in survival environments in order to ensure our individual physical survival. In such environments, it often requires a person to put the needs of oneself and family above all else if physical survival is to be guaranteed. The continuum of individual feelings and needs gets skewed towards feelings and thoughts that would be considered, quote, evil, unquote, in a heightened and aware consciousness like that of someone like Jesus, whose consciousness teachings are contained in the Bible's New Testament. It's been extremely difficult for humanity to make the transition from the more self focused ego consciousness of its survival period to one that is more aligned with the universal hum, because we have built our societies and societal structures to nurture ego, thereby boxing ourselves into an unnatural state that limits possibilities. The moment we begin to define reality through separation, we begin coding ourselves away from our own unified internal hum. The tree of knowledge of good and evil represents this dual state. Duality is a mindset or perception that divides reality into opposing, often conflicting categories. For example, good versus evil, self versus other, right versus wrong, me versus you. It creates a sense of division, pitting perceived opposites against each other instead of viewing them as on a continuum of energetic states. To put it in biblical terms, humanity has exiled itself from its natural state of unity, good order, and connection. In quantum terms, the garden's superposition is all possibilities. The choice to accept the snake's rationalizations and lies as truth collapsed the wave into ego. Our ego consciousness is our fallen state. We changed our internal code. Redemption is recoding and realignment, not just repentance. I should emphasize here that duality is not a natural state. For far too long, people have confused duality with polarity. Polarity is one of the universal laws we have discussed. It is two poles with a continuum that runs between each. For instance, hot and cold are two poles, and something like the temperature of water can exist anywhere on the continuum between hot and cold. The continuum does not exist in the concept of duality. Adam and Eve didn't just fall, they fragmented. The bite rewrote their internal code, shifting them from unity to duality, from resonance to rationale. But the story doesn't end in exile. Redemption is about recoding. It's the conscious act of realigning with the hum, of choosing unity over division, presence over perception. So, as you can see, the garden isn't behind us, it's beneath us, coded into our every choice. We are not just descendants of the fall, we are architects of return. In our next video, we'll decode the ancient allegory of Adam and Eve through the lens of all 18 universal laws, each one a cipher for unlocking the architecture of consciousness. This isn't just myth, it's a map. Together, we'll trace the quantum threads that realign our minds with the field itself, confronting the fiery sword that guards the threshold of Eden. What awaits on the other side is not a return to innocence, but a restoration of inner sovereignty. The garden, not as memory, but as blueprint. Thanks for watching.